Hey everyone, this is lecture 3.2. Here we're talking about pollution versus catastrophes, more like everyday pollution versus catastrophes. What's the difference there? How does that change how we treat it? How does that relate to how it hurts us on a physical level? That's what we're talking about here. So, first in general, I'm going to kind of talk about the difference there. Then I'm going to give some examples. In terms of content warnings, we are talking about cancer, we're talking about poverty, racism, that general kind of human suffering stuff on a societal level. So, during the 1800s, cities were absolutely filthy with air pollution. People weren't, unobservant. They saw it, they smelled it, it was there, but, and also, they knew what caused it, right? You see the smoke coming out of the steel mill, it's like, that's where the smoke is coming from. But they also just kind of dealt, right? Because that is what we call everyday pollution. It is just in our environment, and it is kind of very sad, but predictable that when humans are exposed to something like this on a day-to-day basis, they do just kind of deal, which is it's really sad. You contrast that then with a catastrophe, a very clear, gigantic, real bad thing that happened. That is something we tend to take notice of. It wasn't like that 5 minutes ago, but now that oil rig is on fire, right? And it is 20 stories high. If you look at that lower picture, for a sense of scale, look at those firefighter boats. Those things are, if I remember correctly, around like the length of a football field. Those are big, big boats. And the oil rig itself, the Deepwater Horizon, which spilled millions of dollars, not millions of dollars, millions of gallons of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico and spewed all of that carbon into the atmosphere. That's the kind of thing that we are more likely to notice. And in general, then that's how we break it up. Additionally, we tend to emphasize the catastrophes because it's easier to kind of see. A couple quick examples. The Great Pacific Plastic Patch in the middle of that ocean, that is something that exists, and it's something that's there, and we know it's there. And then additionally, we don't actually experience on a day-to-day basis, most of us anyway, so we forget about it. The NUMEC affair, that is kind of something I love to talk about almost endlessly, but that is a a radioactive uh, radioactive disaster spill, contamination that happened near close to my hometown. And now, to the people that live there, that is everyday pollution. You know, every family just kind of has a couple people that dies of leukemia. Everyone knows that. And hopefully that sounds preposterous to you, but in my hometown, that's how it is. And another thing like the widespread use of glyphosate in farming. Glyphosate is a highly effective slash dangerous herbicide, but in those areas that use it, and a lot of the farmland in the United States does use it, it just, is just something that's there. So yeah, sure, everything for a couple miles around has kind of a weird, vaguely waxy crayon smell, but that's for the corn, and the corn makes us money, so we'll ignore it. That's what everyday pollution looks like, as opposed to catastrophes like the Flint water crisis that I'll talk about in a little bit, or the Chernobyl incident that occurred in the former Soviet Union, now the Ukraine. That is one of the more famous nuclear disasters that has happened in our planet. The Bhopal disaster, probably mispronouncing that. I hope I'm not. That is a major chemical explosion that happened in India. If you were an adult when any of these things happened, you would know exactly what that was because it was a specific incident. Those other things, though, you would be less likely to even notice because, well, it was always there all the time, right? We don't see the things that are right there because it's in our lives every single day. I mean, there's big old trees in my yard that I don't look at every day, and like I've forgotten about them for months at a time. Each of those, additionally on the slide, that are highlighted orange do have more resources to help you learn about if you so choose to. So if you want to get in those slides and click that, by all means, go ahead. So it is also important to point out then that human health concerns are not always in line with the environment. That usually those human health concern issues are that tends to fall more within the realm of everyday pollution, right? So a wetland could be drained to minimize the presence of disease-carrying mosquitoes. It's a very real thing. Well, yeah, that can hurt people, but what about that ecosystem that you drained, that so-called swamp that you drained, that there were all of these other life forms in there? You're telling me that that doesn't matter? That's a very mid-20th century thing to say, isn't it? We need to consider as a society how much are we going to value some human discomfort versus entire ecosystems. Or removing garbage or sewage. This is a more day-to-day one that is kind of more troubling on a visceral level. By virtue of having our garbage taken away by the company that does that, it doesn't go away. It just becomes a massive pile of garbage outside of the city. In Columbus, that's near the south side of the city. All of the garbage that you use, especially if you don't recycle, everything you've used in the last year still exists. It's just in a big pile somewhere else, right? So in getting your garbage away from you, yes, that definitely keeps you healthy. But in terms of ecological disaster, concentrating it all in one area, it's still a problem. So these things do keep humans healthy, but they hurt the environment. And if we really do take into consideration what are we doing to the environment in the name of human health, that may cause us to need to adjust what we do to be sustainable in an even greater extent, as if things aren't complicated enough. Similar kind of concept here is that of environmental racism. This is a super important concept in the course. I know I mentioned it in multiple places, but it's critical. Many sources of pollution result in environmental racism, which is the condition of members of a given minority group being disproportionately affected by a source of pollution as compared to members of the majority group. For example, people who are kind of systematically oppressed, right? People of many racial minority groups are systematically oppressed in the United States. Well, they can't afford a big fancy house, so they have to live in a more modest place. And those more modest places are often where things like incinerators, things like nuclear power plants that aren't taken care of to a great extent, that's where that winds up. And it should also be pointed out that most types of pollution are capable of resulting in environmental racism, namely because hyper-rich people, hyper-privileged people don't want to live near pollution, right? So if rich people don't want to live near the thing, that means that the land around it will be more attainable to those that don't have very much. So poor people will be disproportionately exposed to it. Additionally, then, and this is really where why we call it environmental racism instead of environmental classism, is because our country, not just the United States, but other places as well, but in our country, we still do have de facto segregation, meaning that, yes, it is absolutely illegal to keep people from living in an area solely because of their race, but neighborhoods are very, very, very persistent, right? They are a very persistent social construct. When you live in an area and it's a nice place and you decide you're going to live in that city, well, you might live there. You'll live there for decades. You could live there for like a lifetime, maybe, potentially. And even then, a lot of people keep living in the same general area as their parents and maybe even their grandparents, right? And maybe even their great-grandparents. Well, if you're one of those people, you might live in an area that was segregated, isn't segregated anymore, but if you're a white person, there's a very real chance that you live in an area that was designated for white people. You're a black person, you live in an area that was designated for black people. Nothing's still enforcing that law, but that's just kind of how property ownership works. Isn't that interesting? So when they were building these great polluting factories, when class privilege, when white privilege was very much part of the legal structure in the United States, then of course we are going to see underprivileged neighborhoods be where the factories are going to be, because the powerful do not want that stuff near where they're living. On the global level, the truly macro level, we can start then talking about the global north versus the global south. This is a phenomena that sometimes we use the outdated words first world and third world. Those are words very much of the Cold War, and they're not hyper useful, especially relating to the current state of Russia as it exists. So the terms global north tends to refer to those places that were colonial powers during the era of colonialism, and then during the Cold War, there are places, the first world anyway, there are places that are within the global north that remain privileged in the macro level economic sense. And then global south places are those places that were the victims of colonialization, the victims of kind of that global exploitation. You will note then one of the reasons that those terms don't work super great is because Australia and New Zealand are included in that global north, even though they are very south. And then there's another artifact of colonialism present in this map that we're looking at, is that what you're looking at there in terms of map lingo is a standard Mercator, a standard image of the planet. And in that image of the planet, Africa and South America are very much geographically bigger than that. And then the area of northern Russia, which is northern Asia, which is mostly Russia, and then the United States and Canada, those are actually bigger than they actually are. So what I'm saying here is there's a lot more people in the global south than this actual image looks like. Did I miss anything else on this one? No. Cool. So let's look at some examples of these catastrophes versus everyday pollution. Medical incinerators are absolutely classical ones, or incinerators of any kind. As long as humans have had the ability to burn things at very high temperatures, it has been quite tempting to burn up our garbage to get rid of it. And unfortunately, that was very popular for quite a long time before we realized that, hey, when you burn something up, the matter doesn't actually go away, it just goes into our lungs. But once those incinerators are put in place, then that becomes stuff that everyone in the surrounding area breathes. And again, as I've said a couple times already in this lecture, rich people don't live near medical incinerators because they can afford not to. That is everyday pollution. Another example of everyday pollution is the polluting issues surrounding fracking. Fracking is a controversial method of extracting natural gas from shale deposits. Natural gas, admittedly, is a bit better for the environment on the most superficial level. It is still a greenhouse gas. It is not on the global scale as damaging as straight up CO2 carbon emissions. But where natural gas is dangerous is how it is extracted by basically drilling holes into massive shale deposits and pulling that natural gas out of those shale deposits. And in the process of doing that, there are millions of gallons of water, of chemically laced water, put into those shale deposits. And shale deposits tend to exist under water tables. And as the gas rises up through the shale deposit, it will interact with the water tables. So you get then methane and other elements of natural gas in water itself, which makes that water not drinkable for human beings. Big problem. And it also makes that water damaging to surrounding ecosystems as well. So when people are interacting with fracking related water, it has been known to make the water actually flammable, which is a big problem because there is methane in the water itself. And that is almost more of a showy kind of issue. The deeper, more serious issue is the pollution of the water itself and the unusability of the water itself. Now, this is an issue of, well, how extensive has the cover-up been? We know that, I mean, logically, there are probably issues that the natural gas companies aren't telling us about this practice. This is to the best of my knowledge, I'm pretty sure this is still true. We don't know what's in those chemicals that they shoot into the actual shale deposits. And in all likelihood, those chemicals are also polluting the water tables as well. In the most practical sense, then, it's making water unusable for people. And of course, this is probably no shocker to anyone, the areas that are being fracked most extensively are the areas where poor people are living. And I can say from firsthand experience from people I know that those gas companies do not give people the best deal. They very much, well, at least my parents, lowballed them in terms of buying their mineral rights. And I'm leaving a lot of details out. But basically, some places where this has happened have been Colorado, Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, specifically the area around Youngstown. And as if Youngstown hasn't had enough problems. And some of those areas in the early 2000s suffered from actual earthquakes. Now, again, earthquakes are very flashy too. When there's an earthquake in a place that it's not historically known for earthquakes, that gets noticed super quick. The water pollution element here is the greater risk to actually people. It's just a deeply troubling practice that, like, in almost any calculation, like the little bit more natural gas that could be used to be slightly less damaging than actual fossil fuels, not worth this environmental price. Other water table issues that would also be considered everyday pollution are increasing water where it shouldn't be, and not enough water where it should be, right? There are certain cities that are continuing to lack water, and this will become ever more as climate change increases and becomes more intense. In all likelihood, western desert cities such as Phoenix, Arizona, such as Las Vegas, Nevada, possibly Albuquerque, New Mexico, some of those places, may become unlivable because there won't be enough water there, because prior to about 100 years ago, certainly 200 years ago, we put cities where there was water, right? Because humans need water. Once we started putting cities where there isn't water, and then growing those cities because we could pull the water in from other places, and then some of those cities, like Los Angeles, grew bigger than their water table. So most of the water in those areas are either in like grassy lawns or crops or people, not in the actual water table. It's already creating quite severe issues. Southern California has had very dangerous droughts over the last couple years, and that also feeds wildfires and then too. But not only that, we have cities that are having and will only continue to have too much water, to the point where there will be water in places where it shouldn't be, which causes diseases. And cities like Miami, maybe New Orleans, cities that are very close to sea level, have a distinct possibility, almost definite by most estimates. Significant portions of those cities will flood and probably become uninhabitable. That is the reality of what we're looking at here. Very distinct possibility Washington, D.C. could become one of those places. There is a very distinct possibility that New York City will be fundamentally different. As it is, the subways in New York City are completely reliant on water pumps to take the water out of the subways. If those water pumps become no longer usable, or they start to be overcome by raising water levels, one of the more minimal effects it would have on that city is making large portions of the subway unoperable, which, if you've ever been to New York, that so-called minimal problem, that would be a big, big, big problem, because the city relies on that. Concentrating animal feeding operations, so-called factory farms. These are a major cause of everyday pollution. Again, on this image, scale is super important. You look at those, what look kind of like lines. Those are massive, massive buildings. And to get a sense of scale, toward the bottom of those buildings, there is a tractor trailer truck that is running kind of not parallel, but like kind of wonky parallel at an angle to the building. That's a tractor trailer truck. So just look at how big those buildings are that are all full of pigs. And those pigs are packed in there, and that purple water there is they're shit lagoons, basically, is what they are. Those are completely toxic. Animal poop at and a little bit of animal poop, honestly, unless it gets in your body, won't hurt you. But when it scales up, when there is more of it than nature can absorb, it does become actually toxic. And that when there are, say, floods in areas like this, and this may be, I don't recall where I got this picture. I think this may be a picture of either South Carolina or North Carolina, which is another area that is expected to have increased flooding in the coming decades. Well, when there is flooding, these sewage lagoons overflow, and you will also see that green area around it. That's farmland, so it could pollute the crops. It could make the crops either kill them or make them unusable, and it definitely would also pollute the water table in those surrounding areas. And this has happened before. Really, this isn't a matter of something that isn't happened. This is something that's going to happen with greater intensity and more often, and maybe something that kind of drives us to eating less meat as a society, which wouldn't maybe necessarily be a bad thing in terms of environmental costs, because the meat industry is quite damaging. And I'm saying this as somebody with an increased protein need, being someone with ADHD. We do have increased protein needs, but we're going to have to change probably. Additionally, then, these kinds of places breed what's called zoonotic diseases, which are diseases that are capable of spreading from animals to humans. And those zoonotic diseases tend to be more virulent. They tend to be more dangerous. They tend to be deadlier. And one of the elements of COVID is that it is also a zoonotic disease. And that is one of the elements that makes COVID more dangerous than other types of colds, like the other types of COVIDs. You probably already know this. COVID is a type of disease, and what we call the common cold is actually a version of a COVID, if you will. So the Flint water crisis is kind of hard to classify in this regard. I call it a prolonged catastrophe. It at its very beginning certainly was a big noticeable thing. What happened in Flint was that in the 40s to about the 1980s, Flint, Michigan was a really great place to live, actually. There were large automobile factories there, and most of the workers there, because they had good, solid unions, they got paid a very respectable and meaningful wage. And when large portions of the population get paid well, then infrastructure works, right? And part of that infrastructure can be then the water system that we get our water out of. But when that infrastructure breaks down, then decisions and choices have to be made for, well, what's the best of the greater good? And one of those issues was that as a cost-saving measure, the city of Flint decided to stop getting its water from Detroit, which has an operational water system, and to start getting its water from the Flint River, which sounds preposterous because it's a very polluted river, but there were pieces of pre-existing infrastructure there from before they used the Detroit water system, so they thought, well, we'll just save some money, we'll go back to the old system. What they didn't anticipate, though, was that old system was made largely of lead pipes, and the river was far more polluted than they originally had anticipated. As a result, the water in Flint, similar actually to the water surrounding fracking sites, became very polluted. And this image strikes me as particularly striking. And this is all because I think it captures what's been described as the viscosity of the water. The water in Flint almost has a slimy quality to it, which is just, it's unimaginable. And obviously then this water is not drinkable, which is a big problem, but it's also not even safe for bathing in, right? It's not usable in any way. If you take a shower with this water, it can give you skin rashes. It's entirely unsafe. And then a layer under that, if you are exposed to this water over an extended period of time, it is quite easily to develop lead poisoning. Lead poisoning is a incredibly, incredibly dangerous and painful disease that doesn't go away. Once you have been exposed to lead, and then you stop being exposed to lead, it continues in your system for years, and its effects on your body can continue for the rest of your life. Because adult bodies are more resistant to lead exposure, namely because after we're grown, our body absorbs less from the water that we take in, because growing bodies, they're more susceptible, right? They're more prone. That's why kids get sick easier than adults do. Well, when kids' bodies are exposed to lead in this way, it can damage their kidneys, it can damage their hearts, their circulatory systems, their brain cells. It can cause brain cognitive issues. It can stunt growth. It can do basically, it affects all of the systems of a growing body that we hope to work and be productive to making you a healthy adult. It hurts those systems. It is such a incredibly bad problem when a water source is polluted by lead, because it directly impacts children. And the lead levels in Flint were 2 to 3 times higher than the acceptable level, and this has impacted at least 30,000 children in the Flint area. In 2018, activist groups did make the crisis in Flint a political matter. It did get some modest attention during the 2018 election cycle, which wasn't a presidential cycle, but it was like the interim election. And some progress has been made in terms of this, like we're talking about it here and now, but we are still talking about it because it's still there. It hasn't gone away. Many of the areas of the city do get, through a series of lawsuits, they do get bottled water given to them, but you still can't, I mean, you would have to bathe in that bottled water too. It's not viable. So if you had the resources to do it, you would move away. But who can't move away? The poorest of people, the people who are most vulnerable, and the people who have been most historically abused. So I'm ending this one on a high note. I do promise you the second half of the course is a little bit more optimistic, but we have to trudge through this human misery for a little bit. Thank you so much for listening to this, and let me know if you have need any help on any of the assignments or anything.